Being able to trade down within tiers at positions while still maintaining production is by far the easiest way to add draft capital or more assets in general to your Dynasty roster, and that is going to be the point of this video. The way this is going to work is I'm going to show you guys stats from two similar players, but one of them is valued at a premium in startup drafts or trades, and the other is valued as the more generic version, and then we're going to break it all down. So first up, we have a running back comparison, and our premium running back is currently 25 years old, and in 16 games played last year has averaged per game 12.9 rush attempts, 2.4 targets, 70 total yards, 1.1 total touchdowns, 16.5 fantasy points per game, with 11 top 24 weeks, 9 of which were top 12. Then our generic running back is currently 25 years old, and in 15 games played last year, averaged per game 16.7 rush attempts, 3.5 targets, 91 total yards, 0.7 total touchdowns, 15.7 fantasy points per game, with 11 top 24 weeks, 7 of which were top 12. So do you have your guesses on who each player is? Well, our premium running back is James Cook, currently valued as the RB9 on Keep Trade cut at 45th overall in Superflex rankings, and our generic running back is Chuba Hubbard, valued as the RB20 at 80th overall, so essentially 3 rounds later than James Cook. Now listen, I like James Cook. I think he's a very good running back, and he's finished as the RB12 and RB8 overall in back-to-back seasons in total points. That is phenomenal. But at the same time, he's really been the same player in back-to-back seasons, and it really does feel like his ceiling is kind of capped. In 2023, he rushed for over 1,100 yards on 237 carries, averaging 4.7 yards per carry. He also caught 44 passes for 445 yards. In 2024, in one fewer game played, he rushed for over 1,000 yards on 207 carries, averaging 4.9 yards per carry, caught 32 passes for 258 yards. If you'd give him credit for one more game based on his averages, his 2024 is basically identical to his 2023 in every single statistical category except for one: touchdowns. He only scored 6 total touchdowns in 2023, then scored 18 total touchdowns in 2024. That is insane variance, with more games of double-digit touchdowns than not scoring at all last year. But while some people may view that as a positive, I see that as more of a negative. That type of season is not repeatable, and I wouldn't be shocked if his touchdowns were cut in half in 2025, just because Cook isn't really built for a big workload, and even though he's in one of the best offenses in the league, I think it's clear that the Bills don't want him to be a true bell cow either. 207 rush attempts last year was good for 19th at the running back position. 1,009 rushing yards was 16th at the position. 38 targets was 33rd at the position. He only played 485 total snaps on the year, which was 23rd at the position, and his 30 snaps per game was actually 35th at the running back position, but thank goodness he tied for the most rushing touchdowns in the NFL to give him a career year of RB8 overall in total PPR points and RB11 in fantasy points per game. Do you see where the issue is? Do you see why, if everything stays the same for James Cook in 2025, that his fantasy season is not repeatable if he rushes for 1,100 yards again on under 240 carries? If he had even 6 fewer touchdowns last year, he would drop from RB8 overall to RB18, in between Joe Mixon and David Montgomery, and actually behind Chuba Hubbard as well. You see, I think we're still undervaluing Chuba based on how he rose to being the RB1 based on his draft capital, the team that he's currently on, and we still have some hope, I think, that Jonathan Brooks will return and be the Panthers' RB1 that he was drafted to be last year, or perhaps even more competition being added with how deep this running back class is, and I am 100% guilty of all of that as well. But I think that all of that is just so past Chuba Hubbard right now because he's proven to be a workhorse, he can stay healthy, and that he can be the most productive piece in an offense that's been very underwhelming for the entirety of his career. In fact, Chuba was actually a way better player than James Cook was last year, basically across the board. He played in 15 games, put up almost 1,200 rushing yards on 250 carries, basically matching James Cook's 4.9 yards per carry, and he scored 10 rushing touchdowns. He also caught 43 passes for only 170 yards and a touchdown, so he was active in the passing game, but he didn't really do all that much with it. He was just kind of a dump-off machine. And that's his entire season numbers. He really didn't even take over as the guy for Carolina until week 4, playing under 60% of snaps each week in weeks 1 through 3, but then never playing below 65% of snaps from week 4 on, and really averaged more like 80% of snaps every week from week 4 on. So from weeks 4 through 16, Hubbard was on a 17-game pace of over 1,400 rushing yards, 14 rushing touchdowns on 300 carries, plus his 48 dump-offs for another 150 yards. So we're looking at a dude who last year was producing more like a 1,500 total yard, 15 total touchdown guy on 350 total touches. So just imagine what would happen if this offense does improve in 2025, if Bryce Young does get better, if they add more weapons so that the entire offense was better, leading to more sustained drives, more touchdowns opportunities, so that Chuba doesn't have to do everything himself to make the offense run. And Jonathan Brooks is not going to be back in 2025. I would be utterly shocked if he was back off of 2 ACL injuries back-to-back on the same knee. And maybe the Panthers do draft the guy in April, but I would say that that's more indicative of Jonathan Brooks' situation, Miles Sanders being terrible, that they need better options behind Chuba Hubbard than indicative of Chuba Hubbard himself. Basically, the same argument that I used for Kyren Williams last year when the Rams drafted Blake Corum. It was never because of Kyren Williams or wanting to replace Kyren. It was more indicative of the weapons and running back replacements that they had behind Kyren Williams. It's the exact same thing here for Chuba Hubbard if they were to draft another rookie this year. Right now, Keep Trade Cut has the difference between James Cook and Chuba Hubbard as about a late second-round rookie pick or future second-round pick in 2026 or 2027. But that could also be a veteran player like Jacoby Myers or Juwan Jennings if you want some extra wide receiver depth, maybe even Michael Pittman or Courtland Sutton if you can get them, or perhaps even Tank Dell if you just want to sit on him for a year until he returns in 2026. It could also be a legitimate starting tight end like Mark Andrews or David Njoku, or maybe you take the shot on Justin Fields in Superflex getting a starting job this year. Now next up we have a wide receiver comparison, and our premium receiver is currently 29 years old and in 17 games played last year averaged per game 6.9 targets, 4.8 receptions, 65 yards, 0.8 touchdowns, 15.8 fantasy points per game with 12 top 24 weeks, 5 of which were top 12. And our generic receiver is also 29 years old and in 16 games played last year averaged per game 8.4 targets, 5 receptions, 68 receiving yards, 0.5 receiving touchdowns, 15 fantasy points per game with 7 top 24 weeks and 4 top 12 weeks. All right, get your final guesses in now because our premium wide receiver is Terry McLaurin, currently valued as the wide receiver 30 on Keep Trade Cut at 72nd overall in Superflex rankings. And our generic receiver is Courtland Sutton, valued as the wide receiver 44 at 104th overall. So once again, essentially 3 rounds later than Terry McLaurin. And I'll be honest here, this is the exact same comparison as we just had with the running backs, just at the wide receiver position. Terry McLaurin looked great this year, a career year for fantasy as the wide receiver 7 overall, now that he has a legitimate quarterback throwing him the ball and the rookie of the year, no less. But that wide receiver 7 finish once again just feels a little off. See, even though he was the wide receiver 7 overall, that's really just because he played all 17 games. He was actually the wide receiver 16 in points per game and was barely better than the wide receivers behind him in the top 20. He saw the fewest targets in a season since his rookie year. His receptions per game were basically identical to his career average. His receiving yards were identical to his career average. Even total first downs were also in line with his career average. But the one thing that drastically changed this year was again touchdowns. 13 touchdowns on the year, nearly doubling his previous career high of 7 and nearly as many as the previous 3 seasons combined. So just like James Cook, everything was the same in 2024 for Terry McLaurin except an abnormally insane touchdown output. But Courtland Sutton, on the other hand, actually had a career year across the board. It was the most targets he's ever had in a season, the most receptions he's ever had in a season, the most yards in a season since 2019 before his ACL injury, and the second year in a row with 8 or more touchdowns. He was the wide receiver 15 in total points, the wide receiver 26 in points per game, and that includes a legitimate donut week halfway through the year. You take that game out, he was averaging over 15 PPR points per game in the other 16 games, which would be top 20 on the year, only a couple spots behind Terry McLaurin. But there are also other similarities between the two wide receivers. As mentioned already, they're just weeks apart in age. They both turned 30 years old in season this year before week 6. So there's no dynasty advantage between the two based on age. Also, as shown, their fantasy production was nearly identical. It was only separated by 1.5 points per game if you include Courtland Sutton's donut, but less than a point per game if you remove it. Both guys are the wide receiver ones on their own teams with 2024 rookie quarterbacks. We just prefer McLaurin because his quarterback is better, but both teams also still have strong incentives to add a better wide receiver 2 this year to continue the development process of their now second-year quarterback. So both could see legitimate competition in 2025. Washington actually has twice as much cap space to work with than Denver does this year, but Denver picks 9 to 10 spots in front of Washington in each of the first 2 rounds. They're both literally the exact same player in the exact same situation. The only difference is that Terry McLaurin is coming off of a slightly better fantasy season because of a better quarterback, because of more touchdowns scored, but you're also paying that tax for that marginal performance boost that could also come crashing back down to earth without 13 receiving touchdowns next year. Why not take the cheaper guy when everything else is pretty much equal? Right now, the difference between the two is around an early 2025 third round rookie pick or possibly a future second round pick in 2026 or 2027, depending on the person buying Terry McLaurin. Among veterans, you're looking at other older wide receivers who could still be productive in 2025, guys like Calvin Ridley, Christian Kirk, Stephon Diggs, Keenan Allen, maybe even Hollywood Brown or Rashad Bateman if you want a little bit of a younger wide receiver depth. You could also take a shot on tight ends like Ben Sinnott, Theo Johnson, or Jatavion Sanders from last year's class. Or honestly, if it were me, I would want that handcuffed running back that could start if the guy ahead of them gets hurt, specifically Tyler Algier, Blake Corum, Ray Davis, Isaac Orendo, Jerome Ford, Audric Estime, or I would just take that early third round pick because then I'd probably just draft a rookie handcuff there anyway. And finally, we have a quarterback comparison, and our premium quarterback is currently 23 years old and in 17 games played last year, average per game 33.1 pass attempts, 208 passing yards, 1.2 passing touchdowns. He averaged 2.8 fantasy points per game from rushing, but 14.5 fantasy points per game total, with 11 top 24 weeks and 4 top 12 weeks. Our generic quarterback is 25 years old and in 10 games played last year, averaged per game 28.5 pass attempts, 204 passing yards, 1.1 touchdowns. He averaged 3 fantasy points per game from rushing, 14.2 fantasy points per game total, with 8 top 24 weeks, 2 of which were top 12. All right, one last time, get your final guesses in because our premium quarterback is Caleb Williams, currently valued as the QB9 on KTC at 21st overall in Superflex rankings. And our generic quarterback is Trevor Lawrence, valued as a QB16 at 44th overall, so 2 rounds later than Caleb Williams. And again, the situations for both guys are wildly similar. Both quarterbacks are former first-round picks, tagged as generational prospects coming out of college. Both quarterbacks are currently going through a coaching change this year, and both of them received the 2 best offensive-minded coaches that they could get. I know a lot of people love Caleb right now because of Ben Johnson, but Liam Cohen is also terrific and helped give Baker Mayfield the best season of his entire career. Both quarterbacks have really solid receivers around them, with Brian Thomas Jr. probably being the best individual receiver out of both teams, but DJ Moore and Rome Odunze being significantly better than anything else that Jacksonville has, though I wouldn't just write off Christian Kirk as a very solid wide receiver 2 when healthy, and Evan Ingram is an always reliable receiving tight end, but overall, I'd say they're fairly comparable, even though I would rather have Chicago's group as a whole. Both quarterbacks offer solid fantasy value with their legs, averaging around 3 fantasy points per game last year through the rushing game. Both quarterbacks have very little support from their actual run game, with DeAndre Swift and Travis Etienne both being awful last year. And both quarterbacks have really meh offensive line play. Jacksonville is definitely better than Chicago, but that's not to say that they're drastically better than Chicago. And listen, I get it. Caleb hasn't played enough in the NFL to really scar us yet. He still has a ton of potential and upside in a Ben Johnson offense with the receiving weapons that he has. And Lawrence has been below average to really bad for the majority of his 4-year career so far. But we've also seen really good stretches of games from Trevor Lawrence in 2022 and 2023, that now with an upgraded offensive system, he could finally be able to be the quarterback that he was drafted to be out of Clemson. I mean, let's not forget that prior to 2024, Baker Mayfield had just one 4,000-yard season in 6 years played. A career 62% completion percentage, had eclipsed 25 touchdowns 3 times, but never had more than 28, with a career high 5.6 touchdown percentage and a career average of 4.6%. Then year one with Liam Cohen, everything spikes. 4,500 passing yards, 41 passing touchdowns, an insane 7.2 touchdown percent, and a 71% completion percentage. He was phenomenal, and that was without Chris Godwin for half the year, without Mike Evans for a few games, and Jalen McMillan didn't do anything until December either. So if you give Trevor Lawrence that same offensive system to maximize his strengths and his weapon strengths, with Brian Thomas Jr. being the alpha and nice receiving supporting weapons behind him like Christian Kirk and Evan Ingram, maybe even a 2025 rookie thrown in there too, I don't think it's impossible for Trevor Lawrence to have a career year, to put up 4,500 passing yards, 30 to 35 plus touchdowns, and he has the rushing ability to add a few extra points per game on the ground. Lawrence is just a great buy low right now, an even better guy to target in a trade down from other upside QB2s like Caleb Williams. Right now, the difference between the two is around an early 2025 second round rookie pick, but I would also bet that you could snag a late first round pick if someone is really in on Caleb Johnson or really out on Trevor Lawrence. That does not feel unrealistic at all to get like Trevor and the 2025 110 or something like that. And among veterans, there are so many different ways that you can take this with that much value left over between the two. You're looking at Jalen McMillan, Josh Downs, Khalil Shakir, Ricky Pearsall, Jerry Jeudy even as the wide receivers in this value range on Keep Trade Cut. Legitimate flex plays every single week. You could possibly snag a Mike Evans if a team is looking to shed some age and they're buying Caleb Williams for the long term. You're also in the Alvin Kamara, David Montgomery, or Brian Robinson range at running back if you're competing and you want that extra weekly RB2 or even RB1 in Alvin Kamara's case. You might even get Chuba Hubbard, again, if someone's really shedding age or they just aren't sure on Chuba Hubbard, you might snag him here in a trade down like this. Or maybe it's just George Kittle at tight end, a legitimate top 5 guy at the position, but again, getting older, so dynasty managers might be wanting to get out now before the age cliff truly hits. Again, these trade downs are not saying that I am out on the player that I'm advising to trade down from. I'm just trying to highlight that you might get a little bit of extra value by identifying a player very similar to your highly valued player, that you can get some extra assets on top of that. I mean, who doesn't want extra assets? Extra seconds, extra thirds, and extra first in Trevor Lawrence's case with Caleb Williams. So why not try to just trade down, get a very similar player, but get those additional assets that could be the difference between you upgrading somewhere else or gaining an additional asset that you didn't already have.